Let's try to walk through Ezekiel really quickly. So, chapter 1 is the theophany, a fairly famous one, talking about a chariot that God's throne is now riding on. Ezekiel sees the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord, but everything is described as appearances, and it's difficult for him to describe exactly what he sees. The four living creatures imagery that you see in the book of Revelation, you had kind of common ancient Near Eastern um, creature, like these composite creature things. These are also associated with the mobile throne of God, even as it was in the book of Numbers. Chapter 2 is his calling, and all of this happens, by the way, in the 30th year, which is probably the year that he turned 30 years old. This would have been 4 years into their exile after they had been deported. So when he was 26 years old, he would have gone into exile there with his wife. And now that he's 30 years old, when he became a priest, he was called. So, Son of Man, this is kind of unique imagery for Ezekiel, probably referring to his humanity and his frailty. And the spirit, this entered into me as in my feet. That's one of the unique things you'll see in Ezekiel is this spirit empowering. So going on through chapter 2, he's given a similar call to have a stubborn heart, just as Isaiah was. Then he gives him this command that he should be a watchman, and anyone who he warns and they turn away, but if he doesn't warn them and they don't turn away, then Ezekiel is held responsible for them, for their iniquity. By the way, this sort of sets up an interesting theme in Ezekiel, which is this individual nature of things. Not that there wasn't individual consequences for sin in the Deuteronomic law code and all of the Torah. It's definitely a continuation of a theme that is already there, but it is unique to Ezekiel. He's really getting at this individual nature of your relationship with God. Okay. Then he gets into these object lessons or sign acts, however you want to talk about that. Oh yeah, this is chapter 4, but at the end of chapter 3, there's this interesting thing where he becomes mute and unable to reprove them. You could interpret that as unable to be a mediator for them. There's a chance that he's talking about he's not allowed to pray for them, that sort of thing. But it is mostly interpreted by people to mean that he is only allowed to speak when God tells him to speak. So then he becomes unmute later on in life. So it can't just be talking about a generic morally good thing. This is a unique part of his ministry, especially for the first part of his ministry, uniquely whenever he's supposed to be giving more of the judgments, which is why it's a difficult riddle to solve, this one. Okay, so chapter 4, chapter 4 through 24 is the majority of his ministry to the nation of Israel. Remember, he's in exile while he does it. So they're in exile by the Chebar Canal. He does this interesting sign act. He makes a model of Jerusalem, and then he lays down on his side for a total of 430 years, which is the same number of years as the Israelites were in Egypt. Interestingly enough, it's more time for the northern nation than it was for the southern nation, and he does sort of get this idea that there's this atonement of sins. So here's Ezekiel sort of saying that there is a sort of way of looking at this as people suffering for the sins of their fathers. That'll be an interesting point that comes up later on. So just note that this is going on here, okay? Obviously, more sign acts about how they're going to have poor food supply during the siege. And then he's within that model that he made, he's supposed to chop up his hair. He gets completely bald, no beard or anything. And he burns a third of it with fire on the inside of the city. And that's supposed to correspond to the famine and the pestilence. Then he chops up a third of it by the sword, and that corresponds to the ones that are left being killed by the sword. And then he scatters to the wind, and that's the ones that go into exile. Here's where he just kind of explains it. So this is all chapters 4 and 5. Notice that when he starts to talk about how he will satisfy himself by his fury being vented on them, that is how they shall know that I am Lord. And this is the first of the what they call the recognition formula. They shall know that I am the Lord. It occurs 70 times in Ezekiel, and this is exactly the sort of phrase that was used over in Exodus 5 through 15, 7 different times to talk about how the Egyptians or the Israelites or Pharaoh will know that I am the Lord through his execution of judgments in the plagues and that sort of thing. So it's a similar theme. And the Israelites would know it also through his salvation. And when there was a distinction between the salvation and the judgment, it was called so that they will know that I am the Lord. The same thing is going on here in Ezekiel, where God's judgments and salvation are correlated with the people knowing that he is the Lord. Chapters 6 and 7, there is good stuff in here, but we're going to move over this because we've got to go fairly quickly. 8 through 11 starts this really cool vision of the Spirit, and of the Spirit taking Ezekiel to the temple that's over in Jerusalem. It's like 2,000 miles away. And he gets to see these terrible abominations that are occurring in the city, close to the temple, and that sort of thing. And they're driving me far from my sanctuary. Earlier on, we didn't look at it, but his judgment is described as departing from them. So that's the same thing that's going on here. He says, I'm going to be driven away. Remember this. So it says here, this is in the 6th year. So this is in 592. And that's when he's having this vision. That'll become important because what's going to happen in this vision is that the Spirit is actually going to leave Jerusalem and leave them open and vulnerable to attack. So here he's just outlining the different, they're weeping for Tammuz, that's a pagan god. They're worshiping the sun towards the east. This is like right next to the temple. Okay. All of this idolatry. They're satisfying themselves with their pictures, basically. Now, the most interesting thing in this whole account is not the Spirit leaving, in my opinion. It's this weird vision of these executioners in the city who pass over people who have this mark on them. It's in Ezekiel chapter 9 and in Revelation chapter 9. The same thing happens. Those who have a mark on them are passed over. It recalls the Passover itself. But here, it's not all of Israel. It's only the Israel within Israel, the forehead of the men who sigh and groan of the abominations that are committed in it. So these are people who have faith that are being preserved from the judgment. It's a very Israel within Israel type of perspective, which is there in the Old Testament. Occasionally the predominant metaphor is all of Israel being judged. And so previously we looked at sort of a corporate nature of sin, and this one is talking about the individual nature of sin, and they were all executed. So this is kind of a reference to, is it talking about the exile or not? Seems to be talking about something that maybe the exile is pointing to, right? Because we know that it's not just the exiles that were like the good people and the people that were killed that were the bad people. That's not how it actually worked in 586. Okay, so continuing on with chapters 10 and 11, it starts to talk more about how the Spirit is moving up and around. And this is the same vision that you saw in chapter 1. It's the same sort of chariot with these wings where it can go up and down, left or right, whatever. He cries out. So here's an interesting thing that betrays the false theology of the prophets there. They were in Jerusalem who were saying that it's basically impossible for people to come against this city because, we have the Spirit in the temple and stuff like that. And so they're sort of envisioning the walls of the city and the protection of God as this cauldron that will protect them from the fire, and we are the meat. But Jeremiah, I think Ezekiel just says, like, that's a weird example. I mean, I'll just flip it on your head and say that, yeah, fine, you guys are the meat, but you guys are the dead meat in the midst of it. And so, but you see their theology there coming out. And then after he gives this judgment, he talks about this terrible thing that's going to happen. Ezekiel then cries to God and says, God, will you make a full end of the remnant of Israel? And this is the first place where you get this sort of vision, this glimpse of future glorious restoration. He says, I've been a sanctuary to them among the countries where they have gone. Then he gives them this land promise, right? I will give you the land of Israel. So this is them coming back. And then he gives them this new covenant language. I will give them one heart and a new spirit I will put within them. By the way, the Spirit is going to be a unique contribution from Ezekiel to this theology of this new restoration. Notice that their hearts are being circumcised, that they'll keep my rules and obey them. But then, after this great hope, like this great glimpse of the great hope that you also get the most terrifying thing that happens in all of it. The cherubim lifted up their wings with wheels, and the glory of the Lord went out from the midst of the city and stood on the mountain that is on the east side of the city. So the Spirit has departed from Israel, and they are left open and vulnerable to attack. as in 4 years later. It does actually happen that way. Or the siege comes 4 years later, and then 2 years after that, it falls. 592 is this vision. 588 starts the siege, and 586 is when it falls. Okay, then he, so that was this vision that he gets. Then he's getting these basically continuation of these visions of this coming exile. He had to prepare exile's luggage and dig through the wall, and he's saying that's going to be what the kings have to do. Which, Zedekiah ends up doing, and his eyes are gouged out and that sort of thing. Okay, chapter 13 is just talking about the false prophets, peace, peace, when there is no peace. It continues on this theme of even the people's relationship to the good prophets, that they are trying to inquire of the Lord, consult of the Lord, and he's saying, I'm not going to do that as long as you're harboring all of this sinful practice. And that's weird. Interestingly enough, notice this one. If the prophet is deceived and speaks a word, I, the Lord, have deceived that prophet. This will become interesting later on because he talks about a law that is not good. And we think that that's talking about a false law that the Lord did not give through the Torah, but rather was orchestrated by the Lord for the people. Okay, also notice this theme here. Even if Noah, Daniel, and Job are in it, they would deliver but their own lives by their righteousness. Continues that even if Noah, Daniel, or Job are in it. So they would deliver only their own lives. Here's this theme of an individual judgment, remember, that we were looking at in chapter 9, when people are marked and only those useless stick. Not much to say there. Chapter 16 is a very famous parable of the faithless bride. We're just going to fly over this one, but this one you should just know is a very famous parable in Ezekiel, worthy of much study and meditation. Let's go to chapter 17. Here is a judgment against Zedekiah, talking about the two eagles, and he is being tempted. So he's a low-spreading vine, and he's being tempted by Egypt and by Babylon. Then he gives this prophecy of a time when there will be no longer any of these other birds. And so the mountain of the house of the Lord, I will plant it, and you get this imagery of Zion. Okay, chapter 18, very important for the theology of Ezekiel. There's a lot of discussion about this one. So they have this same proverb that we saw in Jeremiah, chapter 31. The fathers have eaten sour grapes, and the children's teeth are set on edge. I mean, the dad eats the bad grape, and the child makes the sour face, Then he says, nope, the soul who sins shall die. So what he's getting at here is that you guys are saying, if it wasn't for the sins of our fathers, we wouldn't be having to suffer this terrible suffering. And Ezekiel's message to them is, no, you are suffering for your own sins. That's what he says over and over again. The soul who sins shall die. The son shall not suffer for the iniquity of the father, nor the father suffer for the iniquity of the son. Okay. Interestingly enough, Lamentations 5, chapter 7 says, we bear their iniquities, talking about the sins of our father. And just earlier, we saw that they were going to atone for the sins of their father. This is two different perspectives on this sin. So I do think that this is a continuation of what you see in the Torah already. But this is trying to show people the great weight of all sin and the suffering attendant that is justifiably given to all sin. And this is giving you a hint of the New Testament doctrine of hell. And he's trying to show you here that you're not suffering unjustly, even looking at it from an individualistic perspective. Yes, there is a corporate perspective that is true, that you as a whole are now in exile because of the sins of your father, looked at that way from a covenantal perspective. But I think here he's giving you new perspective on the nature of sin and the nature of judgment and how that works. And then he says, have I any pleasure in the death of the wicked, declares the Lord? Have I not rather that he should turn from his way and live? And then he says, for I have no pleasure in the death of anyone. And this gets at a question of, does God delight in all that he does? This is one of the Arminian questions, is that if he really doesn't have any delight in it, then how could you say that he ordains these things? It has to be the idea that man has complete responsibility. Man does have complete responsibility, but that all of the power is in the hands of man, that God has given that over to man, and that God wants it to be the other way, but he can't help it. And this one is used quite a bit for that. The interesting thing, though, is that if you compare this with Isaiah 53, the same word is used for the pleasure that he has in crushing the sun. which is a death, right? So how can it be that he does have pleasure and doesn't have pleasure in it? And this is why the Reformed teaching of the preceptive and the creative will of God is there, because it's there in the Bible. From a preceptive standpoint, he has no pleasure in it, but in the creative will of God, he has pleasure in it. The way that I've heard this compared is to a mosaic, or where you have each individual panel, and viewed from just one panel, he might not have any pleasure in it, but viewed as a whole, as a part of a larger one, he does. Okay, moving on to chapter 19. Chapter 19 is a dirge for the kings of Israel, and it has this interesting parable of a lion who is devouring widows. Remember the injustice aspect of there. And then they take him in hooks in a cage and brought him to the king of Babylon. And Israel was mostly brought in hooks. That's how they would carry off their people to Babylon in exile. In 20, he does a revisionist history. Not a revisionist. He's not changing the history, but he's drawing out aspects of it that might have shocked them. Okay, so he says that from the time that they were in Egypt, they were idolaters, and none of them cast away the detestable things that their eyes feasted on. This would have been fairly shocking, because in earlier metaphors, there was this idea that Israel was actually pure, like a young bride, and got corrupted later on. Here's the interesting stuff where he says, it's over here actually, I gave them statutes that were not good, and rules by which they could not have life. Okay. And notice though that just right here, he echoes Leviticus 18:5. I gave them my statutes and made known to them rules by which if they do them, he shall live. So clearly we know that the law is good, and he's affirming that the law is good. This is why we think that when he says these statutes that were not good and rules by which they could not have life, he's referring to a false law that he orchestrated, similar to how there was false prophecy described earlier. And the same thing can happen with poor teaching, which is exactly what he's accusing them of in chapter 22. They don't know the distinction between the clean and the unclean. So this is a big, long chapter where he goes into basically every kind of accusation known to mankind, false religion, injustice to the sojourner and the fatherless and the widow, lots of descriptions of just horrible sin in Israel that was predicating the judgment that they have. But notice here that they're not making the proper distinction. They're smearing a whitewash for them, right? And so this is where they're corrupt. So the possibility of there being a false law orchestrated as a judgment from God to the people of Israel is very possible. It's probably what he's talking about. Okay, 21, the righteous and the wicked are both judged. So there's that corporate perspective of sin and judgment, which is true. We know is true. And then here after, so this is a judgment on Zedekiah, basically talking about how he's not the real king, but that there will be one coming who will execute judgment. And that's a prophecy to Christ. Okay, so 22. So we've already talked about 22. So let's just move on to 23. 23 is a very famous metaphor, similar to chapter 16, of these two adulterous sisters. They played the whore in Egypt, and they played the whore in their youth. Here's going back to that same theme that they've always been wicked. Oholah is Samaria, and Oholibah is Jerusalem. And notice that he says, so Oholibah, Judah, became more corrupt than her sister. Remember, her sister defiled herself with idols, after whom she lusted, and then the Assyrians seized her sons and daughters, killed her with the sword, and she became a byword. And now it's the same thing that you saw in Jeremiah. Oholibah is even more corrupt than her sister. Okay. So then he says, I will put an end to your lewdness, which was begun in Egypt, which actually he did. This problem of idolatry is basically solved by the exile. That's one of these things that was fulfilled by 539. They did not come out with the same idolatry problem. And again, he's just trying to say, so defile yourself with your idols. You shall drink your sister's cup. That's a cup of judgment. You have forgotten me. Notice that he says that they slaughtered their children to sacrifice to idols, and that they offered them up for food, their children. So the children whom they born to me. This is something you also see in Jeremiah. Very common themes between Jeremiah and Ezekiel. And don't forget that Jeremiah would have been alive during Ezekiel would have been alive during a lot of Jeremiah's ministry. So when Jeremiah was around 40 years old in 605, and he gives his 70 years prophecy, and it sets off a chain of all of these crazy events where they hate him and try to kill him, stuff like that. he would have been about 18. Ezekiel would have been about 18, kind of at the height of Jeremiah's ministry. So he would have seen a lot of this. So there's a good reason there's a lot of overlap between Jeremiah. All right, we're almost to the end of the judgment portion. Remember, that's 4 through 24. The last part of the judgment portion is chapter 24. And he says, it starts out with the siege of Jerusalem. Not much to say about that there. It gives you kind of a date of like around 588. And then down here, he's talking about something that's going to happen later on. A fugitive will come to you and report to you the news. So this is before the destruction. So right around 587, Ezekiel's wife dies. And Ezekiel would have been about 37, 36 years old at around this time. So I'm about to take that light of your eyes from you. You shall not mourn or weep, or your tears run down. And then he says, my wife died. And then the reason is that you're not going to be able to mourn when this happens. It's going to be like people who've experienced a war zone, like PTSD. You won't have time to actually mourn and grieve. And then this is where it ends, right before the oracles against the nations. So that ends the first major unit of the book.